Hi, Pierre.
Hello, Sandris.
It's my pleasure to interview you. And my first question is, what is a good musical composition for you?
What is a good musical composition for me? Sure, that puts me on the spot. I probably would have to say it's a music that invites the listener in. I think it's a music that's not so foreign that it doesn't attract someone or take someone by the hand immediately. So I think it reveals something of itself at first, so that there's an opening into this world to explore, if it makes sense. So I think it's important not to be too strange or something too foreign or new. Something familiar, I would say then. Yeah, to have something familiar.
And maybe you remember the last piece which you invited, which you have that feeling.
I think the piece you put on the on your playlist, I think has elements of that, or that's what I feel. It reveals the melodic material, I think, immediately in the beginning, and it also tells you the sounds I'm using, because I think it's introducing the toy piano without any of the other sounds. So you hear the clean sound first, so that you know what to listen out for during the piece. Yeah.
And how would you describe your music, right?
There's a lot of things that I always wonder, or that goes on in my mind when having to describe my music. What can I start off with? Things that I find interesting is to hide structure. It's not something that's in the foreground. My music often has a sort of a discovering element. You have to figure out what's going on in it. But things are structured in a way so they are you're able to discover them. So it feels to a degree very random and maybe not so structured, but it is very structured. So I would say it's got a very improvisatory kind of feeling, like it feels quite improvising-esque. And then I also like sort of like I just answered previously, familiar feeling. So there are familiar intervals, things that are more tonal, that are more consonant, that are built around triads. So yeah, I can also probably also say my influence, I like jazz music, I like electro music, so I like familiar harmonies, although you don't necessarily hear that immediately in my world. But yes, I think to a degree that covers it. Something else that also interests me is psychoanalysis.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm also interested in the things the composer does without knowing, or constantly goes back to in his world. And I try to discover those techniques and try to understand them according maybe to a psychoanalytic viewpoint of myself. So
can you give example? Can you elaborate on that?
I think I'm afraid of repetition in music. So there's always a constant thing to, when I repeat, I hide repetition to a big degree, and I've worked a bit around it not to make it so hidden. And that there's sort of a psychoanalytic reason or personality reason for that. So yeah, that's one of the things which interests me. Yeah.
Yes. And right, you live in Cape Town, and how,
Yes.
let's say, would your music would be different if you would live in Berlin, let's say, right? Or the question is like how locality, right, impacted your music.
Probably. I don't know if I can say this, but it feels like Germany is probably more homogeneous in terms of its sound world. It feels you hear a German sound easier. It's probably not exactly the same what everyone does, but there's sort of a kind of a feeling there. And it's in South Africa, it feels like people are more left to their own devices, and opportunities to perform are less. So I don't think there's a something you have to adhere to, like an overall voice you have to sound like to get into a sort of a concert program, which I don't know if it's more the case in Europe. It probably isn't, but that's what it feels like to me, that you have to sort of fit in more part of the. So I think that's what is very nice here. I studied in the Netherlands, and I felt that they are more open to sort of finding that voice. So yeah, I think it works in South Africa, and I think I'm not as much influenced by South Africa per se, its sound world.
Yes.
I think the openness and the not specific style is something that works for me in South Africa, but it's not necessarily South African, I would say.
Right.
I am influenced by the sort of Western way of writing music, sort of new music, contemporary classical new music. But being here and not having to fit in, I think I changed that approach a lot. What is important to me and so forth. Yes.
And looking back, right, 10 years back, how your music changed, right? You said that there was a change, right? But then how it changed in 10 years?
I mean, it's still changing a lot, and I think it was much more atonal sounding 10 years ago. Yeah. I really went for the 12-tone kind of sounding music. No tonal feeling, no gravity towards a center, a tonal center. As you can hear, tonality and those kind of things are actually quite important to me, although it's not so clear. But I think at that stage, I think it's a much more wilder, much less aware of the listener at that stage. I also I listened to the Now for Trides recently again. I also found, although there are clear moments, I think it's not always so clear where it wants to go to. I think that's something that's something that takes forever, I think, is to make a piece and let every note make sense. Why am I continuing something? Why? I think pieces often goes on too long. I think that happened a lot in the past of my work. What else? Hopefully it's getting better. I think that's also the biggest worry of a composer, is that he's getting worse, he or she. So I often go back and see if what I did, is it making sense? Why did I do those things? So yeah, hopefully it's getting more clean, more precise, makes more sense to an outsider when listening to it for the first time. I think also the ideas of a piece needs to be more in the forefront of the piece. Although I don't like conceptual composition necessarily, but I have the idea more in the constant process of composing. Yeah, restrict yourself more and become freer in restrictions, not break your own rules easily, but trying to find freedom maybe within those rules, I think.
And what triggered, right? And what you triggered these changes, right? One thing is to understand is your studies, right? In Netherlands, what else?
What triggers changes?
Yes, what was it? Yes, like trigger points.
I mean, it's all very self-absorbed, if that's okay. I think it's listening and trying to understand why you did what you do, and is it good? Is it what you want to do? I mean, it's probably also listening to other music constantly. That's important. Listening to other composers, feedback from people, see how other composers respond, although that's sometimes quite dangerous. Yeah, literal things is difficult to say. This thing of growing and want to evolve is interesting. I don't know, because I think we change as people. I don't know why. It's probably because of what life throws at us, and we want to streamline aspects of ourselves that's in the way of moving forward. So yeah, I would probably say on a literal level, it's probably people, composers, what's out there going on, and probably what oneself is also comfortable with. I think in the beginning, like I said earlier, you want to belong much more as a younger composer to a group. It's more difficult to function by yourself, I think. So one becomes more brave and daring as you becomes older.
Yes.
And less trying to do things that helps you belong. One tries to be more individual. Maybe that's also a thing, to be more unique, to be less, to copy less, to steal less. All those things, yeah.
Got it. And is this right? I understand this is part of what you said regarding, let's say, psychoanalysis, right? An approach, right?
Yeah.
What you said, right? This is mentioned, right? If you would be a female, would your music would be different?
Yeah, probably. I'm sure of it because of my masculine approach and the way I looked at the world, and people looked at me and the role I had to play as a male from a certain age that sort of just put on me. Yeah, no, I think definitely so. That is a very interesting question, I think, because there's a certain thing, being a male, you have to put forward and survive and look confident and be something in a civilization without actually knowing what you're doing. But maybe a community puts some pressures or some ways of being on you, and then you just have to be that without questioning. I mean, it's the same for female, but what I mean is actually it's a fake something.
Yes.
It's not a real something, and you build your whole personality and being around this sort of fake dealing with what is put on you by civilization or community, and I think that creates certain ways of dealing, certain sort of made up personality traits which aren't necessarily your normal way of being, and that creates things you have to discover that are made up, and sort of see if you can rethink those made up ways of being. Yeah, does it make sense?
Yes, I thought when you were saying that, I don't know so much about South Africa, right? But no doubt that at least west part, right, of contemporary art music or contemporary classical music or new music, right, was long time, right, male dominated, right?
Yeah.
So basically, and what you are saying, right, about this, this maybe that there is some kind of, let's say, musical language which is not always. This is only as group stuff, right? It's not like community just accepts, right, this language. And if it was like a very long time male dominated, can we say that music actually is masculine, right? At least contemporary classical music is by a large degree masculine music. Or represents this masculine, masculine language.
Yeah, you mean probably as music is at the moment. You mean it's a more masculine kind of evolved thing? Yeah.
Yes, and it therefore it has masculine language as well, right? So we can say musical language.
That's an interesting thing. Maybe that fits into sort of the political landscape where we have wars and things. That's a masculine way of dealing with certain things. So music maybe also became a kind of music became a certain way of dealing with emotional things for males, dealing with yeah, so that's a very interesting idea. So maybe music is, I don't want to say it's kind of a cover-up, but for males it is to a degree then, because we're not really then, if what could it have been if it was not so pushed by the male psyche and his issues with himself in the world. It's an interesting idea. Maybe it would have been less, I don't know, music can be very aggressive and self-focused, and I think maybe there's something masculine in the contemporary music in that sense. The whole idea of the 12-tone and serial music is a very sort of a very masculine way, and yeah, it's a tricky thing to say. I don't want to say that rebelling against what is a masculine thing, but maybe it's a much more harsh way of looking at the world. It's tricky. I don't know if it's necessary. That is probably, it's not true, but I'm trying to, I'm thinking aloud, but it's an interesting idea, I think.
And how, right, this, and particularly this century, right? But it started in previous centuries. There is a huge increase or huge acceleration in technologies as well as in the music. And how has this impacted you, right? How much you use technology, and what kind of softwares you use or hardware you use?
I actually have an interesting path with technology, because I used technology actually quite early, but I used it in a very primitive way. That intrigued me, so to speak, in a wrong way. So I was always trying to challenge technology and see where it would falter or break, so to speak. The first time I used technology with music was probably with my MIDI pieces, where I used the software Sibelius, and I tried to create sounds which Sibeliusly isn't usually used for. So I tested if I use the software and its instruments in a very extreme way, not what it's built to do, and see what sort of sounds comes out of it. I experimented a lot with that. It's a very electronic world, but I did it with an early piece playable playing. So I would say I use a few flutes, and I would use it playing one flute playing extremely low note, which it can't normally play, or a very fast passage, jumping, say, from a very low register that's to an extremely high register, sort of outside the range of the piano, and maybe continuing that very quickly using what note values, 512th note values or something like that, and then what would come out if I play that, using sort of a selection of those kind of things. So it's a bit like painting with notes, using them in extreme positions, and see how the software reads these very extreme placing of notes, extreme combination of different instruments. So one instrument play one note, and then immediately after that another instrument plays the same note, and then another instrument plays another note, all 512th note values, which is not possible with real ensemble. You can't coordinate players like that. So that was one way of using technologies, explore that. And later on, I explored that with real people. So I combined actual flautists playing then with a MIDI flute player, and see what that brings out. I did it with one of the piano pieces earlier, which is also interesting because they meet to a degree that you can't hear the difference, and then suddenly you hear, okay, this is the real player, that's the technology. So it was interesting for me to see where they meet and where they take their different parts and where they don't meet. And what works and what doesn't work. And then later on I've started using sort of fixed media, making soundtracks or tape sections to pieces, using things like Pro Tools and Ableton. I don't know if you know these softwares. Recording stuff and manipulating them. And so this is what I'm doing more. I've also started to do a bit more of live manipulation of instruments. This is something a bit new to me. But so someone playing the instrument and that signal is going back into the software and is manipulated live, coming out of the speakers again, in combination with the soundtrack, which I composed earlier. So it's the 3 layers of live, what the electronics does to the live instrument, and the live instrument itself, and then the soundtrack. So I have these 3 layers, which I like working with. This is sort of a new thing for me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what is your attitude towards multimedia music, right? Or music filled with videos, performances, and etc.
I mean, I also did a lot of soundtracks, or still doing a lot of soundtracks. So visuals have been an interesting thing to me. I find it quite complicated to match that with sound in my compositions. I did a composition, Multimedia, where the instrumentalist plays in between the visuals often.
Yes.
I try to find, because it is just true that the visual component is the stronger component when you have visuals, because it's the stronger sense, the eye watching. So I try to find, what did I do there? I when there were no visuals, the instrument played, I sort of created a sort of a pulse. When there's nothing, you were expecting the instruments, and when the instruments stopped, the visuals started. And I started to overlap that slowly. The instruments played a bit over when the visuals started. So I tried to create see if they start to overlap, if you still stay with the visuals, or I mean with the audio, or maybe go to the visuals, because you're getting used to the pattern of nothing is audio and visuals goes with no sound, and when there's no visuals, then there's sound. So I played with that, and I also played with the aspect of visuals if you've got static visuals, like just a photograph.
Yes. Which
is an interesting visuals, because it's not moving, so it feels like it's more open to sound actually than moving visuals, which takes your attention away. So I also played around with static images, or static images that moved extremely slowly, or something in the image that moved. So that try to see if I can keep your attention with the audio, or not be so split between the two, if that is something that helps. But other media is probably the technology aspect, I think. And when I use MIDI instruments, which I've used with that toy piano, I think it's interesting to see the instrument while it's performing. I think that is a nice thing of using technology, where it's not only speakers and the static person has to have an instrument which is quite animated like that. The self-made instruments which you can see, that aspect is interesting to me also. To see the inside of to see how something functions when it makes sound. I think that also adds to the psychoanalytic aspect of my making music. It's also the inner workings, showing the inner place of the mind, the inner workings of the sound world. I think it sort of adds to that. Yeah, I don't know if my multimedia world is so extended, but yeah, I'm interested in it and do some of it here and there. Yeah.
Yes. And how you start composing, and what kind of stages you go through? What's your process?
I mean, I try to firstly have it probably always starts with a commission of probably someone that wants something. So I know what instruments I can use that I have available. And then I think a lot about the instrument itself, philosophically, about what the instrument mean to me, how I can use it in a way that's interesting. So often the ideas behind the music is musical philosophical, I would say. So it's often, I try to keep it in the instrument itself. What is unique to the instrument? So often I experiment with a player, so I can see what instrumentalists can do. Maybe something comes up, interesting techniques which the instrumentalists struggle with, or something about the playing is unique to the instrument, which something which I can explore. So I try and keep it in the instrument itself. I don't often like writing about stories or outside world things. I find that a move away from the music. I don't like when music explains something else. I like it when music explains music.
Yes.
Because if to me, often it doesn't really meet. It's not the best way of meeting outside musical things. I think one can write poems about it, and I think they are clearer ways. So, that's only my issue. I know a lot of people will hate what I'm saying now.
Yes. And when music appears, right? At which stage you start writing scores?
So I think I improvise a lot, playing around with ideas. Often I would just sit at the piano and play and try out things, and then something would reveal itself which I like, and I would probably put that on paper.
Yes, it
and
reveals
that
itself,
will then
right?
Yeah.
So it's not like you discover, but music has some structure which reveals itself, right?
Yeah, that is the strange thing. I mean, I come to the piano with a lot of ideas, so it's not like a clean slate. So I come with a purpose, but still, so it's a focus kind of freedom. I come in and play around, but I play in a certain way because I want, and then it reveals, something to me which I understand as something that can mean something to this work. So then I isolate that. Often you play and it feels so good, let's play a bit further, and then you forget what you just did, which is a horrible feeling, and you can never recover that. So often you actually have, if you feel something is amazing, you have to stop, just put it on paper. And then I start to play more around what I specifically wrote down. It becomes a more focused playing then. And if nothing happens with that playing, then I can keep it open, make it open again. I can just sort of leave that behind. But it is a process of not a very linear process. I always want to keep it quite open, a kind of a freedom. I hated to know what I want to do from the beginning. I want to keep it open quite deep into the writing, because I think it's often dangerous to immediately go on this set out path what you want to do. I've often gone on those paths, and then it comes to a dead end, and then I have to make big changes. So I try and keep it open at first.
Yes. And when you said right, okay, you are in the piano, right? There are some ideas, and then you write something. What you write some. So you write scores then, or you write some notes? How?
I literally try and notate. It's maybe like a small motive, a small piece of musical material. I literally try and notate it very exactly. So it's something that happened to me. It's a experience which I couldn't have thought out by myself. It sort of came across my path, and I write it down exactly so that I've got it now as I played it. So it's a very exact replication of what I played. and then I leave it. So then I improvise with this exact thing, or I leave it, play around, still with other ideas.
Yes. And when you start writing all composition, what's
okay? So I think the ideas become sort of more, and I write down more little bits, and they sort of start to become part of a puzzle. And I often find that the composition process is often combining these moments. It's often literally writing the in between, the passageways, the bridges. So often that would be the composing process, I think. And so it is often a bridge, writing the connection between two ideas, but often it's then also a bridge to not necessarily knowing where it's going. That also starts to happen once I have a lot of ideas. I feel confident enough to write into a future, so to speak, into what is to come. But this is although I write it quite exactly at that stage, quite exact, I still often go back to what I've written and change a lot. I've written pieces quite complete, and then I go back and make extreme changes. And once a piece is complete, I often find within a piece things that work, and I isolate them again and erase a lot of what I've written, and just because often a whole piece gives birth to a whole new idea, which is probably better than what you've started with, and then you start to erase a lot of the piece because you've got something even nicer. So it can be extremely cumbersome, and going back to yourself and be open to just sort of kill everything musical just to have something that is even better. To be always open to that is my is how I write. Yeah.
Got it. And what do you fear as composer?
What do I fear? I mean, not being original. Having said that, no one is original, but repeating myself all the time. But that's also something that happens to every composer. I think people often say you write just one piece, writing it from different angles. I don't know if I necessarily like that idea, but yeah, I don't know what to do about that. Writing something that makes no sense to anyone else, which is a scary idea. I mean, one gets so used to a composition, and you don't see it objectively anymore. And when you become aware of actually how strange it is because of someone experiencing it, that is quite a shock often. That's not something nice to, after you've worked on a piece quite long. Yeah, those are the things I can think of now, I would say, yeah.
And why do you still compose?
Why do I still compose? I think there's also something tied to a psychoanalytical viewpoint of the things we do over and over again is sort of part of twitches, things we do in life which we don't know why we do, but it helps to understand reality, to make sense of day to day. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. That's probably quite broad, and very in a life-like environment, but probably also there's also something of you want to hear music which you don't think you've heard, some music you would like to hear. I would probably say that's something else. But often you never like listening to your own music, so that doesn't help. But there's always the hope to write something that you really like. What else can I? That's all that comes to mind now. But yeah.
And maybe now we can talk a little bit about South African, right? Music, new music scene or contemporary art music scene or contemporary classic music scene.
Yes.
How it changed during this century? What are the main changes?
What are the main changes? I mean, the composers that became part of the scene changed a lot, which is fantastic. I mean, it was probably mostly a white male-dominated scene.
Yes.
That changed a lot. So it also helped to influence the music that was written. I think the music that was written was very sort of a watered down. No, I shouldn't say that. That's very dangerous. But a sort of a European kind of contemporary new music way of writing that wasn't interesting. It was just a way of connecting with what was going on there, but not really being part of it. So it was sort of a replica. Yeah, really a replica, not the yeah. Having said that, that's all very dangerous things to say. Let me rather not continue on that path. But I think it has become more less rigid, the music that's been written. Yes. It's not serving this purpose anymore of having to be the far-off brother of Europe. We've sort of become our own identity, I think, is starting to happen with all these other kinds of music, all these different kinds of music coming into play. So there's a confidence that is, I think, that helps us to create our own voice, which is very interesting, which I think is exciting.
Yes, yes. And what do you mean by your own voice, right? South African voice.
I think that's something unique because it comes from, there's so many voices in this small country. It's such a diverse country with so many cultures. I think it's so unique to any other culture, which can be quite homogenous and so forth. And I think what is interesting, there's more of an openness between cultures here. I think because our path has been to really work against these bridges these walls we've been built, to really demolish them in a very visceral way because of how wrong it was. I think because of that political shift, it also helped to be more, to have it more aggressive in the cultural scene as well, which is probably not the case elsewhere in the world, because it's not the division is maybe not as clear in certain Europe or what. So we had to break down this. Also, I think it's a much more direct interaction of other people's music, which definitely has an influence on one. Although having said that, I'm also careful with just taking stuff from the influence. To me is sort of a slow process of maturation. But yeah, so I think it's actually an exciting place to be, with people have exciting ways of looking at music, and it's not so conservative in its contemporary classical music look. I think it's much more open, and it's touching on genres which are a bit away from the contemporary classical, and it's bringing it in, and it's blurring all the lines. So it is very interesting to see what this contemporary classical musical thing will become, what it will be in the end. Yeah.
Okay, I understand, right? But basically, when you said that it was previously white male dominated, right? Now it means both genders and different racial groups, right?
Yeah, correct. And everyone, I mean, everything was going on in their separate communities, but now everyone is becoming aware of everyone else.
Yes.
I mean, it has been now a few years, I mean 20 plus years, but it's become sort of a melting pot of different things, all playing at the same level. Hopefully, not without hierarchy. That would be the
Right.
idea.
And can you just give some examples of communities? What there are? I don't know, jazz, or it's African or South American local, or traditional music. What kind of communities are in?
No, definitely traditional music, Xhosa music, traditional bow players, traditional instruments, the way traditional music connects with technology, that kind of influence is also quite interesting. The technology thing is interesting because everyone brings it into their world, and the way they interact with it is also quite a separate kind of thing, which is interesting, I think, for everyone. Definitely jazz, pop music, I mean, hip-hop music. There's also quite an interesting scene going on with interesting technologies and interesting lyrics and a way of using language, which is I find fascinating. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I'm not very knowledgeable when it comes to it, but I'm very much, I'm looking at people that's making use of all this influence a lot. I'm listening to lots of lots of composers that really use these different cultures, different instrumentalists. It's also nice that with all these different cultures, instrumentalists themselves becomes the package. It's using a specific instrumentalist that plays a certain way, say a certain bow player, traditional bow player, and a composer interacts with that person, which is also a fascinating way of doing it, I think, for a composer, working with what another player brings. Yeah.
And how audience of contemporary art or contemporary classical music change?
I mean, it is still problematic because I think it's still sold in a certain way, and it's still performed in certain venues which are problematic and difficult. So I think it has moved a lot to different places outside of universities, and concert halls, which sort of isolate the activity, and it doesn't really help. I have a festival which I co-curate with another composer, which is at a gallery. So galleries are often spaces which are more less prejudiced spaces, which are more open. I think it helps to host these events at interesting places, and advertise it in different ways, change the programs, of course. I think it's interesting to how you curate the program and themes you use, so that it's open, but it focuses it on this sort of, I don't know, sort of specialist area of making music, to use a word. But it is difficult. I mean, the new music, contemporary things I've gone to haven't been, there hasn't been a lot of audience, visiting these things. It's got a bad name. It's got a troublesome way of presenting itself. Yeah, I think breaking down these walls is one has to be really work towards that. Make it your mission as a composer, also.
Yes. And how you see, right? Because this is a very good sense of it. How you see then, how would look like, right, a new music scene, let's say after 10 years, right? What could be your imagination, right?
I mean, it must definitely be these events that happen quite regularly. That's also a thing that doesn't happen very regularly. Things that happen regularly, a definite community of people, experimentational space, a place where there's an audience member that also understands, an audience community that understands the scene, that that knows the people that's part of the scene. I mean, it's sort of probably a bit more, much more communal. People talking the same language, people that listen, understand it on a different level. It's not only about being interested, and it's really having lived with this kind of music. So it's a different kind of community that's also been opened up to this world, because often this new music thing is also, it's a curiosity. People come because it's new and odd, which doesn't really help, because it's such a moment thing. It's not a place for growing. So it must be this world that grows together, composers and participants and audience members. That would be my dream, this world of people that talks the same language, that thinks this in the same way about music, not so limiting,
Yes.
so caged. Yeah.
Yes, and last question. How you see, what is the role of new music in South Africa society?
It should be to invite people in. It should be to not scare people away. It should be to show people how open this, how prejudiceless this world is in terms of its style. Because doing new music, you start to see what music can be, how broad it is, how you can think about what music is. It's not only these few notes in a certain way. It can be dance, it can be a choreography. It can become such a much more bigger thing, a way of living, a way of thinking about things. So philosophy. So it should be a way of, yeah, looking at life, looking at culture, looking at art. I hope. Yeah, that's all I can think of now.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much for hosting me, Sandris. I enjoyed this. I hope I made sense.